1918. 3 men paddle into the Amazon's deepest channels, hunting proof of giant anacondas. The Smithsonian called it superstition. The rubber trappers called it suicide. What stalked their camp for 6 nights was 60 feet of pure nightmare. Crushing trees, circling their fire, patient as stone. This is the naturalist's account they tried to bury. This is what lives in the deep water, waiting. If you survive this story, hit subscribe. The green consumed everything. It wasn't the cheerful green of spring meadows or the dappled green of autumn forests. This was something alive and aggressive. A verdant plague that infected every surface, every breath, every waking thought. 3 weeks into the Rio Negro tributary, and the color had become a physical presence in my mouth, metallic and organic at once. I convinced myself it was natural, just the jungle asserting its dominance over 3 foolish men in a canoe. But even jungle rot has its limits. What drifted upstream on that 4th Monday carried a different signature entirely. Cloying sweetness wrapped around decay, as if the river had swallowed something immense and was now belching up its dissolution, molecule by molecule. Richard H. Lewis, 28 years old in March 1918. Armed with a Yale diploma and the kind of arrogance that mistakes book learning for wisdom. The Smithsonian's money had bought me 6 months to probe the central Amazon basin, chasing rumors of anacondas that defied every biological constraint. The rubber trappers' tales, my superiors assured me, were nothing more than fear-made flesh. The predictable mythology of isolated men staring too long into dark water. I would be the rational mind, separating observable truth from campfire fantasy. Such hubris deserves what it gets. In Manaus, Carlos Mendez sized me up with a handshake that tested bone density and eyes that had already written my obituary. Somewhere past 40, born of Portuguese stock but forged by the Amazon itself, he moved through vegetation like smoke through screen doors. Present but unopposed. 3 expeditions under his belt, 2 retreats, 1 casualty to fever. Our first day in the canoe, he delivered his assessment without preamble. Your education means nothing here, Senor Lewis. The Amazon doesn't grade on a curve. It only measures whether you're paying attention. João Pereira, Carlos's younger cousin by 10 years, possessed the build and temperament of draft livestock. Powerful, uncomplaining, dependable. 80 pounds of gear through swamp muck. He moved like it was air. 300 miles from anything approximating civilization. He paddled with the same expression he wore drinking morning coffee. But that leather cord around his neck told a different story. 7 charms dancing together. Catholic iconography tangled up with older gods, the kind the missionaries thought they'd drowned, but had only driven underground. When curiosity got the better of me, he smiled with genuine warmth. Insurance, senor. You can never have too much insurance. We planted our flag on a sandbar where the tributary forked around a small island, 40 miles past the last outpost of the rubber trade. The water ran black as old coffee, though the shallows revealed sandy bottom. Carlos explained the tannins leaching from rotting plant matter, turning the river into weak tea. Above both channels, trees leaned in like the ribcage of some vast cathedral, their exposed roots writhing into patterns that seemed almost intentional when the light failed. We erected canvas against the highest ground, suspended our hammocks between palms, and constructed a fire pit from riverbed stones, building our small civilization against the encroaching wild. We were so convinced we were the ones doing the studying. The work fell into routine quickly. Mornings began with the howler monkeys screaming their territorial claims into the dawn, a sound like the world ending in installments. I'd catalog specimens while João prepared coffee and manioc porridge over the fire. Carlos would disappear into the forest before first light and return with fresh game. Agouti, peccary, occasionally a capybara that fed us for days. By noon, the heat made observation work impossible. We'd retreat to the shade, maintain our equipment, and wait for the temperature to drop below what felt like the surface of the sun. Afternoons meant specimen collection. We'd take the small canoe and paddle the shallows, looking for anacondas, caimans, anything worth documenting. I'd spotted 3 anacondas in the first 2 weeks. The largest, maybe 14 feet. Respectable, but hardly the monsters the rubber trappers described. Carlos seemed unsurprised. The big ones don't come to the shallows, senor. They stay in the deep channels where the current runs strong, where the fish are large enough to interest them. How large? I'd asked. Large enough that the big snakes don't need to hunt often, maybe 3-4 times a year. The rest of the time they just wait. It was João who first noticed the caiman situation. On our 11th day, we'd counted 17 caimans basking on the mud flats during the hottest part of the afternoon. By day 18, we were down to 4. I assumed they'd moved downstream, seasonal migration, territorial pressure, something rational. But João shook his head when I suggested it. They don't leave, senor. Not like this. Not all at once. He pointed to the water. Something moved in. Something they don't want to be near. Carlos dismissed it over dinner. Dry season pushes them around. Water drops, territory shrinks, everybody gets nervous. It's normal. But I noticed he checked the perimeter more carefully that night before turning in, and he kept his machete closer to his hammock than usual. The sound started 3 days later. Not dramatic at first, just an odd quality to the night chorus. The Amazon is never truly silent after dark. You get used to the constant drone of insects, the periodic shriek of a bird, the splash of something entering or leaving the water. But on the 21st night, around 2 in the morning, I woke to something different. A kind of rhythmic dragging sound, like a heavy rope being pulled across wet sand. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I lay in my hammock, mosquito netting tucked around me, listening to the forest settle back into its usual pattern. Could have been a tapir, I told myself, or a caiman hauling itself to a different section of shore. The Amazon was full of perfectly ordinary sounds that seemed sinister at 2 in the morning when you were 300 miles from the nearest telegraph office. But at breakfast, Carlos mentioned hearing it too. Something big moving on the south bank, he said, pouring coffee from the battered pot. Didn't like the sound of it. João nodded slowly. My grandfather used to say the big snakes move at night when they're hunting. Slide up on the banks to catch tapir, deer, anything that comes to drink. You hear that sliding sound, he said. You move camp. We're not moving camp based on old stories, I said, more sharply than I intended. I need another month of observations at minimum. We've barely documented the dry season behaviors. Carlos looked at me the way you'd look at a child insisting he could swim across a flooded river. Your choice, senor. You're paying. The dragging sound came again the next night, and the night after. Always between midnight and dawn, always from slightly different directions. On the 4th occurrence, I actually got out of my hammock and crept to the edge of camp with a lantern. The light threw enormous shadows across the trees, but I couldn't see anything moving on the banks. Just darkness and water and that constant green smell growing heavier somehow, like the humidity itself had weight. We found the first tree down on day 26. Not a small tree, a massive kapok that had stood at the western edge of our camp, easily 80 feet tall and 4 feet across at the base. It lay across our path to the small canoe, torn from the ground roots and all. The trunk splintered about 10 feet up like something had coiled around it and squeezed until the wood gave way. "Storm," I suggested, though we hadn't had rain in 5 days. Carlos knelt by the root ball, studying the disturbed earth. No wind did this. He pointed to a pattern in the mud, a wide, smooth depression curving around the base of the tree, maybe 2 feet across. Something wrapped around it, crushed it. João blessed himself quickly, fingers moving from forehead to chest to shoulders. "Sukuriju gigante," he whispered. "The big mother. The one the old people say is as wide as a canoe and long as 3 houses." "That's physically impossible," I said, but my voice sounded thin even to me. The largest recorded anaconda specimen was barely 30 feet. Nothing in the Amazon could. "Nothing you've recorded," Carlos interrupted. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "The rubber trappers don't lie about everything, senor. Sometimes they just see things scientists haven't gotten around to documenting yet." We spent the morning clearing the fallen kapok enough to move our equipment. The trunk was solid hardwood, heavy as stone. It took all 3 of us with ropes and leverage to shift it enough to access the canoe. While we worked, I kept looking at that smooth depression in the mud, trying to calculate what diameter of snake would leave a track that wide. The numbers didn't make sense. At 2 feet across, you were talking about something over 50 feet long, maybe longer. That kind of mass couldn't support itself on land. Basic biology said so. But the tree was definitely down, and something had definitely moved it. That night, Carlos insisted we build up the fire larger than usual. "Big fire, bright light, makes everything nervous," he said, feeding logs into the flames until they roared. "Snake that size might be curious about camp, but it won't come close to this much light, too exposed." We sat in a triangle around the fire, our backs to the flames, watching the darkness beyond. The jungle had gone quiet, not silent, but subdued, like everything was holding still. Even the insects seemed muted. João kept his machete across his knees, and I noticed his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been something older. Around midnight I saw it. Not the creature itself, just its shadow cast against the trees on the south bank by our fire. A shadow that moved low and smooth and impossibly long, flowing between the trunks like liquid darkness. It moved from right to left across my field of vision, taking nearly 15 seconds to pass completely. In that 15 seconds, I watched the shadow of something that had to be, mathematically, undeniably, at least 60 feet long. "Mind a Rio," João breathed. "Mother of the river." The shadow paused. For a moment, I could see its head, or what might have been its head, a triangular shape wider than a barrel, turning slowly as if testing the air. Then it flowed forward again and disappeared into the darkness upstream. None of us slept that night. We kept the fire built high and our backs to it, watching the tree line for any movement. Carlos loaded his rifle, a battered Winchester he'd carried for 20 years, and kept it across his lap. "In the morning," he said quietly, "we discuss leaving. This isn't a research opportunity, Senor Lewis. This is a territorial claim. We're in something's hunting ground, and it's noticed us." But I couldn't stop thinking about that shadow. About what the Smithsonian would say if I brought back evidence, real, documented evidence, of an anaconda 3 times larger than any recorded specimen. My career would be made. Every museum in the world would want the specimen, the photographs, the first-hand account. I was 28 years old and educated and stupid, and I thought I could study something that the jungle itself feared. "We stay," I said, "but we stay alert, and we document everything." Carlos looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your choice," he repeated. But this time, his voice carried something that sounded like pity. The morning brought false comfort the way mornings always do. Sunlight burned off the mist, howler monkeys resumed their territorial screaming, and the jungle settled back into its ordinary rhythms of feeding and being fed upon. In daylight, my decision to stay seemed rational, even scientific. We reinforced the camp perimeter, stringing our remaining rope between trees to create a boundary we could monitor. Carlos cut sight lines through the underbrush so we'd have clear views of the approaches from the river. João gathered every scrap of kerosene we had left, maybe 3 gallons, and placed the containers near the fire pit where we could reach them quickly. "If it comes into camp," Carlos said, loading fresh cartridges into his Winchester, "we don't try to kill it. We try to drive it off. Make noise, fire, confusion. Something that big, you'd need a cannon to stop it, and we don't have a cannon." He looked at me directly. "You understand this, yes? We're not hunters now. We're prey that's decided to stand its ground." I spent the day taking measurements of the crushed kapok tree, photographing the track in the mud, making detailed notes about the shadow's dimensions. Scientific documentation, I told myself. Evidence that would withstand scrutiny. But my hands shook slightly as I wrote, and I had to rewrite several entries where the pencil had skittered across the page. The rational part of my brain, the part educated at Yale, trained in empirical observation, kept insisting this was just a large anaconda, perhaps 35 feet, distorted by shadow and fear. The part that had watched that shadow flow between the trees for 15 unbroken seconds knew better. We found the second tree down that afternoon. Another kapok, this one on the north bank, crushed and splintered the same way. And near it, something else. A mudslide where something massive had entered or exited the water. The slide was 12 feet wide, smooth as glass, as if an enormous weight had compressed everything in its path. At the water's edge, I found a scale. Just one, half buried in the silt, but it was the size of my palm, thick as leather, colored a deep olive brown with darker mottling. João refused to touch it. He backed away when I picked it up, his hands moving through the blessing pattern again. "Escama do demonio," he whispered. "Devil's scale. You shouldn't have that in camp, senor. It will know. It will smell itself on you." "It's a specimen," I said, wrapping the scale carefully in cloth and placing it in my collection box. "Probably the most important specimen we'll collect on this entire expedition." Carlos said nothing, but I saw him exchange a look with João, the kind of look that passes between men who've learned to trust their instincts over education. That night, he asked me to bury the collection box on the opposite side of camp from where we slept. "Just to be careful," he said. "No point advertising what we've found." The dragging sounds came earlier that night, just after sunset, while we could still see the tree line in the gathering darkness. The sound circled the camp, first from the south, then east, then north, methodical as a predator testing a fence. Each time it came from a new direction, João would turn to face it, machete raised, his lips moving in that continuous murmured prayer. Carlos kept his rifle pointed at wherever the sound originated, tracking it, but he never fired. "Save the bullets for when we can see it," he said. "Sound carries strange in the jungle. Could be 50 yards away, could be 200. But I didn't think it was 200 yards away. I thought it was close enough to smell our sweat, our fear, the kerosene we'd splashed in a perimeter around the camp. Close enough to be learning our patterns, our defenses, our weaknesses. Testing us the way a scientist might test a hypothesis, systematically, patiently, without emotion. Around midnight, something changed in the jungle's ambient noise. The insect drone didn't stop exactly, but it shifted frequency, dropped in pitch. Birds that had been settling for the night went silent mid-call. And underneath it all, I heard something else. A rhythmic sound, low and steady, like the world's largest bellows slowly inflating and deflating, breathing, something massive, breathing through the trees somewhere just beyond our firelight. "It's at the camp edge," Carlos whispered, his voice barely audible over the fire's crackle. "Southeast corner, maybe 30 feet out. Don't move fast. Don't make sudden noise." We turned slowly, keeping the fire between us and the direction Carlos indicated. For a long moment, I saw nothing but trees and shadow, and the red reflection of firelight on leaves. Then something moved, not quickly, but with the inexorable patience of deep water current. A shape emerged from behind a buttress root, and even in the uncertain light, I could see its scale. Its terrible, impossible scale. The head came first, triangular and massive, easily 3 feet wide at its broadest point. The eyes caught the firelight and threw it back with a flat reptilian indifference that made my stomach drop. This wasn't an animal in the sense of a creature operating on instinct. There was calculation in that gaze, assessment, intelligence of a sort that had been perfecting its hunting strategy since before humans discovered fire. Behind the head came the body, thick as a rum barrel where it emerged from the undergrowth, patterned with dark blotches against lighter scales that would be invisible in the water. It flowed forward another few feet, then stopped, the head raised about 4 feet off the ground, swaying slightly as if tasting the air. The tongue flicked out, black, forked, as long as my forearm. Testing, learning, deciding. Joel made a small sound in his throat, something between a prayer and a sob. Carlos raised the Winchester slowly, sighting down the barrel, but he didn't fire. The snake was still partially behind the trees, and I could see him calculating the same thing I was. If he shot and missed, or shot and only wounded it, what would it do? If he shot and killed it, assuming a rifle bullet could even penetrate deep enough to matter, would we be any safer? Or would we just be sharing camp with 60 feet of enraged, dying anaconda? "Nobody move," Carlos breathed. "Let it decide we're not worth the effort." The head swayed back and forth, hypnotic in its rhythm. Then, almost casual, it turned away and began to withdraw into the jungle. I watched 15, 20, 30 feet of body flow past the gap in the trees, thick and muscular and covered in those massive scales. The tail finally appeared, another 10 feet at least, and then it was gone, leaving only compressed vegetation and that sweet, heavy smell that I now understood wasn't the jungle rotting. It was the snake's scent. The smell of something that had eaten recently and was digesting slowly in some deep channel pool. Its body a living furnace, processing whatever unfortunate creature had come to the water's edge at the wrong time. We didn't sleep that night either. We couldn't. We sat rigid around the fire until dawn, feeding logs into the flames whenever they began to die, our ears straining for any sound of approach. My mind kept trying to process what I'd seen, to reconcile it with everything I knew about anaconda biology, about predator behavior, about what was scientifically possible in a world governed by physics and metabolism and thermodynamics. An anaconda that size would need to eat enormous prey, capybara, deer, possibly caiman or tapir. It would need deep water to support its weight, strong current to oxygenate its bulk. It would need a territory large enough to sustain its caloric requirements, which meant miles of river, not the small tributary where we'd camped. Yet here it was, hunting our section of water, returning night after night to investigate our presence. "It's curious about us," I said as the sky began to lighten. "We're novel. It's never encountered humans in this area before." Carlos looked at me with something close to contempt. "It's not curious, senor. It's deciding if we're food. That's what predators do. They watch, they assess, they wait for the right moment." He stood, stretching muscles that had been tensed for hours. "And we've given it 6 opportunities now to complete that assessment. Maybe tonight is when it stops watching and starts acting." João was already packing his personal kit, a canvas bag with his spare clothes, his charms, a small wooden cross his mother had given him. "I'm leaving," he said, not looking at me. "Carlos can stay if he wants. You can stay if you want, senor. But I'm taking the small canoe and I'm paddling back to the rubber station, and I don't care if it takes me a week." "We need both canoes," I protested. "You need to stay alive," João interrupted, his voice harder than I'd ever heard it. "My grandfather warned me about the sucuriju gigante. He said if you see one, you run, because they're not animals like other animals. They're older. They remember when humans were just monkeys in trees, and they don't see us as masters of anything. They see us as meat that learned to walk upright." Carlos watched João pack, then nodded slowly. "He's right. This was foolish staying this long. The photographs, the scale, the measurements. None of it matters if we're dead." He looked at me. "We leave at first light tomorrow. Tonight we keep a fire watch in shifts, 2 men awake, 1 sleeping. We pack everything we can carry, and we leave the rest. Science can wait. Survival can't." I wanted to argue. Part of me still wanted to argue, even after seeing that massive head emerge from the darkness, even after watching 30+ feet of body flow past, like animated nightmare. This was the discovery of a lifetime. This was evidence that would rewrite everything we knew about anaconda maximum size, behavior, intelligence. The Smithsonian, the Royal Society, every naturalist journal in the world would want this story. But I remembered the look in those eyes, that flat, patient assessment, the way it had tested our camp perimeter like a tactician evaluating fortifications. And I understood finally what Carlos and João had known from the start. This wasn't a research subject. This was an apex predator in its own territory, and we were the interlopers. We were tolerated only until we weren't. Only until curiosity gave way to hunger, or until the snake decided that the strange creatures by the fire were more food than threat. "Tomorrow morning," I agreed. "We leave tomorrow morning." That night we kept the fire higher than ever, a bonfire that consumed our remaining firewood at a reckless pace. João took the first watch with Carlos while I tried to sleep. But sleep was impossible. Every sound beyond the firelight made my heart accelerate. The scrape of a branch, the splash of something in the river, the continuous susurration of the jungle at night, which I'd learned to ignore weeks ago, but now heard as 1,000 potential threats. Around 3 in the morning, During Carlos's solo watch while João and I theoretically slept, the dragging sound came again. Not circling this time, direct, from the south bank straight toward camp. Carlos woke us with a hand on each shoulder, his finger to his lips, gesturing toward the sound. We sat up in our hammocks, barely breathing, watching the tree line. The smell hit us first. That sweet, heavy scent of digestion and river water, and something older than both. Then the sound of vegetation being pushed aside, not violently, but with the irresistible force of massive weight. Then, at the very edge of our firelight, the head appeared again. Larger this time, or closer, or perhaps both. The eyes reflected orange-red from the flames, unblinking, fixed on our shelter. Okay, and this time, it didn't stop. This time, it kept coming, flowing into our camp like water finding a channel, its body pushing aside the rope perimeter we'd strung as if it were thread. 6 feet in, 10 feet, 15 feet of the creature entering our space, its head now raised 6 feet high, swaying as it tasted the air, tasted our fear, tasted the decision it was about to make. Carlos fired. The rifle's shot cracked across the water like a thunderbolt, the muzzle flash brilliant in the darkness. I saw the bullet strike, saw the impact ripple across those massive scales somewhere behind the head, saw the snake's body convulse. But it didn't retreat. It surged forward instead, its mouth opening to reveal fangs the size of my fingers, curved backward, designed to hold struggling prey until the coils could finish the work. João threw the kerosene. All 3 gallons, hurled from the containers in a wide arc that splashed across the snake's head and forward body, the liquid catching firelight as it flew. Then Carlos's second shot, aimed not at the snake, but at the kerosene-soaked ground between us and it. The muzzle flash ignited the fuel instantly, and a wall of fire erupted across the camp perimeter, 6 feet high, roaring with sudden oxygen-fed fury. The snake recoiled. Not in pain exactly, but with the instant recognition of something dangerous, something even an apex predator needed to respect. It pulled back fast, that enormous body reversing direction with shocking speed, flowing away from the flames and into the river, with a splash that sent water halfway across our camp. For a moment, I saw its full length, 60 feet if it was an inch, maybe more. The body as thick as a man's torso for most of its length, tapering only in the last 15 feet to the tail. Then it was gone, submerged, leaving only ripples that spread across the dark water and faded into the current. The fire burned itself out quickly, the kerosene exhausted, leaving scorched earth and smoke and the 3 of us standing in our hammocks, shaking, alive. "We leave now," Carlos said, his voice steady despite his hands trembling as he reloaded the Winchester. "Not tomorrow morning. Now, in the dark, I don't care. We paddle downstream with lanterns, and we don't stop until we're past the rubber station." Nobody argued. We moved like men possessed, throwing our essential equipment into the large canoe by lantern light. The rifles, the food stores, the water containers, our field notes. I grabbed my collection box with the scale, and Carlos didn't object this time. Let the Smithsonian have their evidence. Let them know what lived in the deep channels where their educated naturalists were too civilized to look. João pushed off first in the small canoe, paddling hard for the main channel, his lantern swinging wild arcs across the water. Carlos and I followed in the large canoe, our backs to the bow, paddling backwards so we could watch the camp as we retreated. The fire had died to embers, just enough light to see the shoreline, to see if anything emerged from the water to investigate what had burned it. We were 50 yards downstream when I saw movement on the bank where our camp had been. Not the snake. Something smaller, four-legged, stepping cautiously from the tree line. A tapir, young one, maybe 300 pounds, coming to the water to drink in the pre-dawn darkness. It lowered its head to the river's edge, unaware or unconcerned with the scent of smoke and kerosene. The water erupted. No other word for it? One moment the tapir was drinking, the next it was gone. Pulled under so fast, it didn't even make a sound. Just a violent swirl of water, a brief thrashing that disturbed the surface for perhaps 3 seconds, and then stillness. The ripples spread outward in perfect circles, catching the lantern light, and then even those faded. Deus nos ajude, João whispered from ahead of us. God help us. It's still here. It's hunting. We paddled harder, our shoulders burning, the canoes cutting through the dark water with soft, splashing sounds that seemed impossibly loud. Every shadow on the banks could be the snake. Every ripple in the current could be something surfacing. The river stretched ahead of us like a throat leading deeper into darkness, and we were trying to move through it while something much larger, much more suited to this environment, hunted somewhere beneath the surface. Mile after mile we paddled, stopping only when our arms refused to continue, drifting just long enough to catch our breath before resuming. The sun rose eventually, turning the sky from black to gray, to a pale, washed-out blue that seemed obscene in its normalcy. How could the sun rise on a morning where we'd nearly been killed by something science said couldn't exist? How could the jungle resume its daily patterns of bird calls and insect drones when we'd just witnessed the proof that all our education, all our careful cataloging of the natural world, had missed something fundamental? We reached the rubber station on the 3rd day. 3 days of constant paddling, rotating watches, sleeping in shifts while the canoes drifted with the current. 3 days of checking the water behind us for any sign of pursuit, any ripple that moved against the flow. 3 days of jumping at every splash, every shadow, every moment when the river's surface broke with surfacing fish or diving birds. The rubber station manager, a Brazilian named Santos, who ran the operation with 15 tappers, took one look at us and poured 3 generous measures of cachaça without asking. We looked like men who'd seen combat, he said. Hollow-eyed, jumpy, clothes rotted from sweat and river water, hands blistered raw. I told him about the snake, about the crushed trees, the scale, the attacks on our camp. I showed him the specimen in my collection box, the palm-sized scale with its distinct olive-brown pattern. Santos examined it carefully, then nodded slowly, unsurprised. The tappers see them sometimes, he said, pouring another round. Not often, maybe once every few years. They call them Mãe do Rio, river mothers. They say the biggest ones are old, older than the rubber trees, older than the missions. They live in the deep pools where the current is strong. Most of the time they ignore people. But sometimes, if you camp in the wrong place, or if the river is low and their hunting grounds shrink. He shrugged. Sometimes they get curious, and curious is dangerous. How large? I asked. The ones the tappers see? Santos considered. One of my men, Rodrigo, been working this river for 20 years. He swears he saw one as long as 3 canoes laid end to end. Maybe 20 meters, 70, 80 feet, thick as an oil drum through the middle. He watched it surface at dawn, saw the whole body, counted to 30 while it swam past his position, said it moved like river current made solid, like the water itself had decided to take snake form. Carlos and João exchanged glances. What we'd encountered was real. Not hallucination, not exaggeration. Real, documented in whispered conversations between men who worked the deep jungle and knew better than to dismiss the old stories. Real, but carefully unspoken in polite society, in scientific journals, in any forum where educated men gathered. I spent a week at the rubber station, recovering and documenting everything in detailed reports for the Smithsonian. I included measurements, drawings, the photographs I'd managed to take of the crushed trees and the mudslide. I packaged the scale carefully in preservative fluid, labeled it with precise coordinates and date. Evidence, proof. The discovery that would validate the expedition and silence the skeptics. The Smithsonian's response came 6 months later. 3 paragraphs, professional and courteous, thanking me for my thorough documentation. The scale was indeed from an anaconda, they confirmed. Genetic analysis suggested Eunectes murinus, the green anaconda, common throughout the Amazon basin. The size estimates, however, were almost certainly exaggerated by difficult viewing conditions, unreliable shadows, and natural fear response. The crushed trees were likely storm damage, the mudslides from seasonal flooding. The photographs were inconclusive. While they didn't doubt my sincerity, the dimensions I'd reported, 60+ feet in length, 2 feet in diameter, were biologically implausible for a species that rarely exceeded 25 feet. They encouraged me to submit future findings through proper channels. The letter was signed by the head of the herpetology department, a man I'd studied under at Yale, whose expertise was considered definitive. My account, unfortunately, fell into frontier hysteria. I kept the letter. I also kept my field notes, photographs, and journal entries from those 3 days paddling away from camp. I kept them in a wooden box in my study, where they remained for the next 34 years while I taught biology at a small college in Vermont. Married and raised 3 children who thought their father's adventure stories were equal parts thrilling and fabricated. I never returned to the Amazon. Carlos wrote once, in 1923, saying he'd guided 2 more expeditions upriver, but refused to camp anywhere near our old site. The rubber station had relocated after a series of tappers disappeared over 18 months. 5 men, all experienced. They'd simply vanished, their canoes found drifting downstream, empty except for paddle marks scored into the wood by something rough and powerful. Juan had become a rubber tapper himself, Carlos wrote, but only worked the shallow tributaries, never the deep channels. He'd married, had children, told them stories about the river mothers, and made them promise to respect the water, to never swim at dawn or dusk, to never camp on certain sandbars that the old people marked with carved stones. Protection through memory, through passing the warning forward even when educated men dismissed it as superstition. I'm 73 years old now, writing this in 1963, and I understand it won't be published in my lifetime. Perhaps not for generations, if ever. The academic establishment has decided what's real and what's fantasy, and a 60-foot anaconda falls firmly into fantasy. Never mind the scale preserved in the Smithsonian storage basement, cataloged but unexplained. Never mind the rubber tappers who continue to avoid certain stretches of river. Never mind the occasional reports filtering out of Brazil about livestock disappearing near water, about canoes found crushed and empty, about shadows seen moving through the shallows at night. Science moves slowly. It accepts new data incrementally, reluctantly, only when evidence becomes overwhelming. Perhaps someday a properly credentialed expedition with modern equipment will venture into those deep channels. Perhaps they'll document what Carlos, Juan, and I saw in 1918. Perhaps they'll believe their own eyes when the shadows move between trees and something impossible flows into their camp. Or perhaps they'll do what the Smithsonian did with my account. file it carefully, note the anomalies, and decide that human perception is fallible, that fear distorts observation, that the natural world operates within known parameters, and anything outside must be error or exaggeration. I hope they're more careful than I was. I hope they bring more kerosene, bigger fires, and the wisdom to leave when the jungle empties of caimans. I hope they listen to their guides when old warnings are offered. I hope they understand that doctoral degrees mean nothing to a creature that was hunting these rivers when humans were still learning to control fire. The Amazon keeps its secrets. It always has. We cataloged a few thousand species during my career, drew boundaries around the known and unknown. But underneath all that careful documentation, the river flows on, deep and dark and full of things that have learned to avoid the light. Things that remember when we were prey. Things patient enough to wait until we forget. My children ask sometimes why I never went back, why I spent my career teaching in Vermont instead of pursuing fieldwork. I tell them the Amazon is a young man's game, that I'd had my adventure and survived it. They accept this because it sounds reasonable, because their father is a cautious academic who wears cardigans and grades papers and grows tomatoes. They don't know about the nightmares that still come 45 years later. Dreams where I'm back in that hammock, smelling smoke and river water and that sweet, heavy scent of something massive moving through darkness. Dreams where the shadow flows between trees but never stops, never withdraws, just keeps coming with terrible patience until I wake gasping. The scale sits in my study now. The Smithsonian sent it back after 20 years, cataloged and analyzed and filed away as inconclusive. I keep it in a glass case next to my diplomas. And sometimes I take it out and hold it, feeling the weight, the thickness, the reality of it. Proof I didn't imagine anything. Proof that education and expertise are useful only until you encounter something that refuses to fit within known categories. Proof that the river mothers are real, and they're waiting in the deep channels, patient as stone, old as the water itself, waiting for the next naturalist, the next rubber tapper, the next fool who thinks that giving something a Latin name means you understand it. The Amazon knows better. The Amazon has always known better. And if you're smart, if you're humble enough to listen to the people who live there and respect what they fear, you'll know better too. Stay away from the deep channels. Don't camp where the caimans won't. Listen when the old people warn you. And if you hear something dragging itself across sand in the darkness, if you smell that sweet, heavy scent on the night air, if you see shadows moving between trees, don't try to document it. Don't try to prove it exists. Just leave. Paddle hard. Don't look back and be grateful the river decided to let you go. Some discoveries aren't worth making. Some secrets should stay in the dark where they belong.